Hello and welcome to JamHammer. In this video, we're going to be taking a look at how to paint the Black Orcs from the Thunder Valley Greenskins Blood Bowl team. We'll be using a simple paint scheme to get these players ready for game day as quickly as possible, while still ensuring that they look great on the tabletop. To keep costs at a minimum too, I'll predominantly be using paints from a single box from Vallejo that I'll leave a link to in the description below, along with all the other tools and materials used in creating this team. As usual, I'll also put the time codes for each stage of the paint scheme in the description too, so you can jump straight to these as needed. We'll start off then by applying an undercoat of black primer. I applied this using a rattle can for the quickest and cheapest available option to me, but if you have a spray gun, that's great and you can absolutely use that instead. Or if you're really on a budget, then an all-over coat of black paint applied using a brush would work fine too. Next though, we're going to apply Zenethal highlight using grey paint. This is much easier if you have a rattle can or spray gun, but you could try to create a similar effect with a directional dry brush of grey. Or just skip this step. To create this effect then, apply a small burst of grey from directly above your miniatures so that it mimics the appearance of being hit by light from above. The sides will also blend from light grey through to black, and this will leave the underside of the minis in shade so you can have a great foundation to build up from. As I want these minis to have a dark green skin tone down the line, I'll only be laying down a grey coat, so there won't be any need for a white spray on these. After this undercoat layer has dried, we're going to begin with creating the green skin on our orcs. For this, I'm going to use a dark green paint, aptly called dark green in this Vallejo set, water this way down like this, so that it flows smoothly, but it's also quite transparent, and then I'm going to apply this to the skin. These orcs have exposed arms, heads, and legs, as well as a bit of skin around the ankles on their shoes too. Watering it down even more than usual will allow that Zenethal undercoat to come through and provide us with that gradient shift. However, since this is so thin, we'll definitely need another layer. Looking at this mini, the grey and black of the Zenethal are coming through way too much. We want the shift in tone to come through, but not the actual pigment. So here we can apply another thin coat of our dark green. We don't need to be too neat here, as this is our first colour, so feel free to use a fairly large brush and just slap this on. Leave this coat to dry, and then, if that grey and black are still coming through, apply more thin coats as necessary. Once you're happy with the appearance of your green paint, it's time to re-establish some of the areas that need to be black. These will likely have been painted or flecked with grey, so we can thin down a black paint and just apply a quick layer of this over these parts. For the Thunder Valley Greenskins, this means that we need to cover over all the armour plates, so the shoulders, chest, back, knees, and their shoe tips too. We can also at this stage cover over any areas that are going to be painted metallic later down the line, as these paints tend to look better over a black base. So we can paint over their weapons and spikes with this black paint too, such as this vicious spiked fist on this orc. Most of the orcs have helmets as well, which will need painting black to match their armour or provide a foundation for metallics later. Once these areas are all covered like this, we can apply some more colour. We'll move on to the next largest area we need to paint, the leather armour, and coat this with a dark brown paint. I'm using this beastly brown paint here, thinned down nicely again, and just applying this to the gloves and shorts of our minis. Trying to be a bit more careful here to ensure none of this seeps over onto that skin, but no worries if it does, as we'll be going over any mistakes like this later, and we can just cover it up with a bit more of our dark green, or black if we go onto the armour. We also want to base the shoes with this colour, but just the leather parts, not the armoured toe caps we've just painted black. We can also use this brown paint on any parts of the base we want to look a bit muddy in the end, such as these gravelly recesses here. I'll leave a link here to a video where we created these flagstone bases if you're interested in making them for your Black Orc team or Dungeon Bowl minis. After letting this brown dry, I checked over my orcs and there was still quite a lot of the black and grey showing through, so I applied a second thin coat. It's preferable to apply multiple thin coats like this rather than trying to save time by applying one thick coat of paint straight from the bottle or pot. If you don't thin your paint, you'll find that finer details on your models become clogged, or tend to show up streaks from your brush strokes. 2 coats later, and that's looking much more opaque, so we can move on to another brown. This time we'll be applying a leather brown, again aptly dubbed leather brown by Vallejo, to paint all the straps holding our Orcs armour on. And there's a lot of them. Each mini will have at least 5 of these leather belts, so try to catch them all. They tend to have belts across their midriff, one across their back, and bits poking out behind the knee armour. They all have a network of these straps on their upper shoulders, and then there'll be a few hidden under their shoulder armour. We can also use this leather brown on anything we'll be painting to look like bone down the line, so any teeth, claws, or tusks can get a coat of this now to make it easier to apply Offwhite in the next stage. Once that leather brown has dried, check to see if we need another coat. Looking good here. Then we can move on to applying some Offwhite. I'll be using this bone white colour for this. I'm going to thin it down and apply it over any bits of string or cloth, such as these on the gloves, as well as the string around their legs, which is super thin, so inevitably spilled over, but we'll correct this later. There's also some drawstrings on the back of their shorts too, so going to give these a coat, before moving on to those teeth, claws and tusks that we painted brown in the last stage. After letting this dry, we can see some of that brown still showing through, but that's okay, as it's settled in the recesses, and it kind of looks like there's shading on these areas. On to the next stage now, and you can mix white and black together here, or use a grey. I'm using the Stonewall grey from that set, and we can use this to cover over the flagstone bases if we're using them. Apply this over the gravel too, but try to overpaint it onto the gravel and then leave the brown in the recesses to try and connote mud and dirt that's settled there. We don't need to worry too much about this getting on the underside or edges of shoes either, as once we've done with the bases, we can use this grey paint to paint those parts of the shoe, plus the tongs, as an undercoat for the next stage. Grab your white paint now, from this set, that's this dead white, and then thin that down on your palette. Then, carefully apply this to those parts of the shoe we painted grey, which is the trim around the edge, the tongs, and the soles where you can see them. Having undercoated these with the grey paint, we'll only need to apply a single coat of the white. Plus, we can leave this grey in the recesses and it'll help to build up some more shadow. We can then apply this white to any parts of the Orky armour that need coating too, such as these parts of the face masks that have these tooth patterns on them, as well as these bolted on bits on this mini's upper jaw too. Just a bit of red to apply now, and this is going very carefully into those eyes. We can also use this paint on the open mouths and tongues of our alt sculpts that are bellowing insults at their opponents. We can now move on to the metallics. Grab a gunmetal colour and use this on the shoulder spikes of our players, they've all got one, as well as this fin on their left shoulder pad. We can then start to apply this to other areas like neck braces on some of the orcs, bits of their helmets, these exposed studs on this model's leather glove, as well as to their weapons, such as this one who's got a brutal looking knuckle duster for cracking some heads. An optional stage here, but just to add a bit of variety to my minis, I'm going to use this Citadel bronze paint, Runelord brass, to paint the trim and spikes of this model's shoes, as well as just to pick out a few metal clasps on their leather webbing. Feel free to paint these gunmetal, silver, or gold instead though. Next up, get your gold paint, it's polished gold here, and we can use this on all the other remaining metal. So we can use it on bits of decoration like around this spiky bit of bone here, as well as on jewellery such as these earrings, and the occasional rivet on their weapons or armour. But mostly, we want to use this on all those buckles on the leather straps. Nothing but the best. These are star athletes after all. We've finished applying our colours now, so this will be a great time to check over your minis for any parts you may have missed, or cover over any mistakes. I went through my orcs and noticed I'd left these teeth unpainted, so I got those with some white, as well as a buckle underneath this one's arm that I'm painting with gold. Then I noticed some slip-ups on this one, so painted in some green to cover over these mistakes. And then finally, there are a few places where I've gone over onto the armour here, so I painted over these with the black paint again. So now we're all set to apply some shade to our minis. For these, I decided on an equal mix of brown, black and water, so a ratio of 1:1:1. I'm using these washes from Army Painter, so strong tone for our brown and dark tone for our black. And then just throw this on all over our mini. We want to move quite fast here and not let any particular area dry more quickly than the others, as this can cause tide marks to form. We also don't want to let this pool too deeply in the recesses too, so it can be useful to have a clean, dry brush to hand and then just wick this away as needed. Make sure to get this on the base too if you're using them, as we want to add a muddy appearance to the flagstone as well as create shading in the recesses. Allow these to dry for a few hours and then they'll be ready for use on the tabletop. But we can add a few extra touches too. We can see that the skin and leather have become quite dark after that wash, so we can start to elevate some of those raised areas. For this, grab a yellow paint, I'm using sun yellow, and add just a little bit to your dark green paint like this. Ensure it's nice and thin, and then we can start to apply this to the raised parts of the skin. We can use that foundational Zenethal to see where light would naturally rest on our minis, and coat these areas with our warmer yellow-green. This will tend to be on the upper portion of muscles on our pretty jacked orc players. Just ensure to keep this lighter colour out of the recesses so that we don't spoil the shading created by our wash. Next we can apply a bit more of that same yellow into our dark brown paint, and then use this in a similar fashion on any elevated pieces of this leather, like these creases near the drawstring here, as well as where the leather is bunched up around the cuffs of the shorts. Again, we want to apply thin lines of this only to these areas and away from those shaded recesses. We can then apply this to the ridges and the leather gloves too. We can then move on to the leather brown, adding in some of that yellow again and just catching the edges and raised parts of these straps too. We want to keep that shade in the middle of these belts where they dip in, but a line or two of this lighter brown on the edges will really make them stand out. We can also apply this colour to any ridges where the leather is bunched up around buckles and rivets too. Take your black paint next, thin it down a little, and then add in a bit of white so we get a dark grey colour like this. We can then use this colour to add some edge highlights to our armour plates. These areas can look a little flat and featureless, so taking a bit of this grey and painting it along edges, ridges and seams in the metal can help to elevate it and suggest light glinting off these areas. You don't need to apply too much of this, just a bit here and there on the ends of pauldrons and around the collars of the breastplates will do a lot to sell this effect. Take your red paint next, and we're going to add in a tiny bit of that yellow again to create a nice warm orange. We can then apply just a touch of this to the edge of the tongs as a gentle highlight, as well as a tiny dab to the eyes to make them stand out a bit more like this. We can get our off-white colour next, and just thin this down as it is. Since we darken these areas with a shade, we don't need to make this colour any lighter. We can then use this to re-establish some of that cream colour that's been diluted by the wash. We do the same with our white areas next. We just want to apply a little of this to edges and tips to suggest light glinting here, and since these areas have been darkened by that wash, we can just use that same base colour again. Grab a silver paint next, and apply a little of this to the edges and tips of those areas that we painted with gunmetal, so weapons and spikes, as well as along the rim of that armour fin on their left shoulders. We can also use this paint to add a dab to the tiny pins and rivets that are placed all over their armour. There's more than a few of these. but since we're only applying a touch of paint, it doesn't take too long to get through them. Take some of your gold paint now and add it into the silver that's left on your palette. We can then use this to highlight the gold buckles and adornment on our players. Just a hint of this here and there on raised parts or edges will do a nice job of adding back a little of that shine that could have been dulled by the wash. Finally, for our bases, get your grey paint again, this was Stonewall Grey, and work some of it into an old brush or a bespoke dry brush. Then, wipe most of this away on some kitchen roll or something similar. Then we want to apply a pretty heavy dry brush of this to our flagstone bases, as well as the gravel parts, like this. Try to avoid getting this on our mini shoes where possible. Next up, we can run a little more brown wash, undiluted this time, into those gravel recesses to add a little more of a muddy appearance to them and really capture the look of that Black Orc pitch. Then, last step, water down some more black paint and finish the trim of the bases. I found that an old cork with some tacky putty works great for this, so we can get to those edges with ease. 2 thin coats of this works well too, to ensure we get full coverage, but without a streaky finish. And we're done! A roster of Black Orcs ready to get stuck in and flatten the opposition. These are all wearing matching leather armour, as well as the black plate and hints of white cloth used by the Thunder Valley Greenskins that will tie them together nicely with your Goblin Bruiser lineman. Thank you so much for watching this video, I hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, please consider liking it, subscribing to the channel, and clicking the bell to be notified of new videos being released. This would be a good time to, say, apply some transfers on your minis, and perhaps a coat of varnish to ensure our hard work isn't chipped away and lost over successive matches on the gridiron. Or take them even further with a few extra highlights on a couple of key areas. There'll be more Blood Bowl videos being released in the future, so please do keep an eye out for more content coming soon to JamHammer. In the meantime, there are plenty of other videos available on the channel, including a few that are on screen now for you to click on. Thanks again for watching.